All right, so now we're going to get to a full three blind solve. I suggest at this point that you are very familiar with solving corners only scrambles and solving edges only scrambles. I really cannot stress enough how helpful it is in your first full blind solve to be really familiar with those concepts. They're pretty easy to get and to practice. So going into a full three blind solve is not too different from just doing a corners only scramble followed by an edges only scramble. You may have noticed that already if you tried that out. So we're going to be doing I'm going to call this a fluffy blind solve, because we're not going to be doing like full brute force memo into, like blindfolded turning and everything. What we're going to be doing is taking a scramble, tracing through it, writing down what we're tracing, and then kind of memorizing that and then executing that, not like while looking at the cube to track anything, but with our eyes open so we don't feel like super confused and uncomfortable. For me, I have a really hard time tracing and tracking with my eyes closed, or I did in the beginning. So let's go ahead and get this scramble going and see what we end up with for tracing. All right, so here's the scramble, and here's the way that people typically go about executing and memorizing a blind solve. What they'll do is they'll start by memorizing corners. So we memo corners. Now, the reason for this is because there are fewer corners than there are edges. There's 8 corners and 12 edges. So the most common method for doing this is memorizing corners first with a visual thing, then memorizing edges with an audio thing. So you'll use the letters to create audio in your head. And then immediately after memorizing our edges, we will then execute our edges because they're fresh in our memory. And then we'll go back to that visual story we told with the corners. Execute with the corners to then execute the corners. Now, I don't use audio because I have a very bad memory regardless. I think it's really critical. The cool part about blind solving is that it's really unique to each person what works best for them. So for me, I'll walk through my memorization process on these. I do go through this process. I memorize corners and then edges and then execute edges into corners. But I don't do audio for edges. And you can do these in any order that you want as long as you memorize something first and then execute it later. You can memorize edges first and then memorize corners. You can also execute corners first and execute edges. It really doesn't matter, but this is the most common thing that you'll see people doing. So we'll just stick with that for now. Now, the process of figuring out where the pieces go on the cube is called tracing. So we're just going to go ahead by starting with tracing our corners. Now, again, we're not going to be brute force memorizing this. We're actually going to be writing down our tracing, and I'm going to walk you through the process that happens when you're tracing a scramble. So if you've done a lot of corners only solves, this should be easy for you. You should have pretty much figured out any problems that you're going to run into. So let's just go ahead and start our tracing here. Now, one thing you will notice is that with a fully scrambled cube, it can be a little bit harder to track the pieces. So take a look at your centers, like keep your eyes on your centers to make sure you're tracing, especially with corners, to make sure that you're tracing your corners to the right spot. Watch those centers. So here we have orange, green, and white. So we can go, orange, white, and green. So we know it's going to be one of these centers and it's the green part. So that's going to be an I. So our scramble here starts with an I. From here, we have this, which will probably go there. So I, J, K, I, K. We've run into that earlier with IK multimedia, so that's handy. And it looks like we have hit our buffer. So if you've done these before, and if you paid attention during the corners part, you should know when we hit our buffer, we just pick a totally new number, or new letter. Now, this I'm going to use as a cycle break here, and we need to remember the first letter that we're going to be using here. I always go to the first available letter of the alphabet. In this case, it's B. So in this case, we will now move on to B. Now, I need to remember that my buffer is in B. And if I get a letter that ends up being B, N, or Q, I need to end that cycle. It'll make sense. And again, if you've done these, you already know this, you're familiar with this concept, but it'll make sense when we run across it because we'll hit a piece that we've already solved. So we're going to go to B here, and B goes to, it looks like, and then O. So B, O, and then this is a twist. Okay, so we've got B, O, which goes here, and then this needs to go here, which is UVWX. And then X goes to U. So XU. Let's see, and U goes to this one here, which is N. Now, remember, N is part of B. So when we put N in here, our cycle is now over. Now, when you reach the end of a cycle, if you've had to start a new one, it's good to check the rest of the letters to see if that's the end of it entirely. This could just be the end of Corner's memo, or Corner's tracing, I should say. But there might be more after. There might be another cycle that opens up. The way to know this is by checking, by putting your fingers on all these pieces. So we know that these are solved. So we've got I right here. I is solved. A is always solved. Like A just stays there. So we've got I, K, B, O, X, I think it's back here, U, right? X, U, and then N, which is B. So you'll notice that all of the corners are solved except for one, which is this one. And that's going to tell you one of two things. If you only have one corner left and all the other corners are solved, that corner is either solved or twisted. So looking at this, you can see it's in the right spot, but we got to move it around a little bit. And we're just going to make a letter pair to untwist this corner. I think we could do, let's see, JC. We'll just do JC here. In JC. And this kind of is its own cycle, but it's really just a corner twist. Again, if you've done a lot of corner solving, this won't be a new concept for you. So this is our corners letter pair list right now. So this is corners, which is cool. So now we can move on to edges. And you notice we've got one lone C out here. And if you've only done corners only scrambles and edges only scrambles, this has never happened to you, or this shouldn't have ever happened to you. And if it has, you've probably learned why this doesn't work. But we'll talk about what to do when we only have one little letter lonely by itself at the end here. And it's good that we ran into that. So let's go ahead and start memorizing or tracing our edges. And notice that as we traced back over our corners, like everything made sense and we had everything was solved by the end of it. And that's how we know our tracing was correct, more or less. Okay, so edges, instead of swapping A with P, we're swapping this piece out with that piece. So where does this piece need to go? It needs to go to this. So we start with E. If you've done edges scrambles, this will all make sense to you. It goes E and then I. So EI is our first thing here. And I want to talk about kind of my process of memorization here, like as I'm tracing, is I'll look for, I should have done this with corners, but I'll look for kind of like as I'm tracing things that I'll pick up on, letters that I'll pick up on, and try to like loosely memorize them while I'm tracing to get an idea as to what I'll be doing. So in this case, IK Multimedia is, they make guitar equipment and stuff. BOX is box, UN is United Kingdom, and JC, like I have a friend named JC. So IK Multimedia, now this is not normal. This is not how everybody memorizes. Typically they'll have, if you're like blind solving a lot, you'll have specific things for each letter pair. So this will be like, I know body odor, a character named Zoo, New Jersey, and then something, you'll put like a Z here to indicate parity, and then have like, I don't know, Czech Republic or something. Either way, I like loose, fuzzy memorization. I'm a big fan of just kind of taking what comes my way and doing what works for me at the time, which changes day by day. So I had IK in a previous scramble. So I'm really, IK Multimedia is like in my head right now. This spells the word box, UN, and JC is a person. That's an analogy, or whatever acronym. So in my brain, I'm saying, JC's holding a box in the United Kingdom, and the box has IK Multimedia in it. And then I after building that story, I kind of like trace the order of importance. So it's this little guitar amp, and it's in a box, and they're in the United Kingdom, or the United Nations, and JC is holding it. So I'm just going to like get that in my brain for a little bit. IK box UN JC. Boom, got it. Cool. It's really important to memorize your corners because remember, they're going to be like the last step of the process here. So you got to really be able to recall this. And I'm going to review that too. So we start with the edges and EI. The reason I bring this up is because EI, I'm already thinking like Einstein, like EIEIO from, the song. There's a few ways this could go. But whatever works for you when you see EI, that thing that really pops out at you, run with that one. You want to kind of use that and start looking for that while you're tracing without focusing on it, just kind of like idly thinking that stuff in the background. And that process gets better and better the more you do it. Again, if you've done a lot of corners and edges, you're already pretty familiar with this process. So we've got E to I, and then I goes to UVW, it looks like. Yep, W, and then that goes to, I believe, H, WH, White House, So Einstein's in the White House kind of stuff. That's just how I'm loosely remembering this at the moment. That doesn't feel right, so I'm just going to check it. Yep, there it is. And then A, and then we hit our buffer. So we have A, and then there's a cycle break. Dun, dun, dun. Again, this should not be super troublesome if you've done some corners and edges only scrambles, but let's go ahead and think about what we want to do with our cycle break here. In this case, I know that all the pieces aren't solved, so it's obviously there's going to be another cycle. So what piece do we pull in? An unsolved piece, but what we already have solved is E, I, W, and H, and A, right? So our top layer is already solved. This is going to be very useful for tracing to know that our top layer is entirely solved. This is our buffer, so we don't solve it, and everything else is solved here. So really, I can just get the top layer out of my brain entirely and say like we've got W and we've got H. So I like L because L is really easy to set up to. So I'm just going to move this to L. Now what this means is that our buffer is now in L. So if we hit L or F, then our cycle is going to be broken. We're going to either be done or we'll have to make a new cycle. So I'm keeping my eye on L, but we're tracing from L now. L goes to O, L, O, O goes to J, OJ. So I've got Alabama, OJ. Einstein's in the White House with Al. There could be a bunch of Als. And OJ Simpson, or drinking orange juice, or this could even be something like Alabama. But we'll see. I'll play with that later. OJ. And then here we have doop, EFG, right? G, and that's not part of L. And then we've got MN, right? GN, good night. GAN, there's a lot of stuff that could be. Let's see. N goes to EF. So now our cycle is over because we got it to F, and L is where our buffer is. So that cycle is done. Now we have a lot of letters on here, so we might actually be done depending on how many solved edges we have. And then we want to inspect for flipped edges, just to make sure our finger. So this is the process of tracking your tracing, where after you're done tracing, you kind of put your fingers on all the pieces to make sure they're all accounted for, more or less. It's like you're running around with a bunch of children and you're like, did we get all of you? So we've got Einstein, White House, Al, OJ, good night, and then F. I'm just going to kind of, we know that the top layer is solved here, right? So E, I, those are solved. This is solved. A is solved. So we've got W, H, L. Okay, good. O, and O, J, I, J, G, E, F, G is down here. N is here, and F is same thing as that. So looking at this, our top layer is solved. Now we can infer that our right layer is completely solved because all three of those were done. This one's done, that one's done, this one's already solved, this is done, that's done. So you can really just say like, okay, we're done. We have accounted for all of the edges, and they're all solved. You know what I mean? So we're done with tracing at this point. The tricky thing about putting your fingers on the edges to account for them is that you don't have that many fingers. So I always look out to see, are all of these pieces solved? Are all of these pieces solved? So I can just take my fingers off of those and say, my front face is solved. It's something you get better at with time and practice. So if all is good in the world and we have correctly done all of this, we should be able to just basically execute these letters and have it be solved. But there's something you may have noticed here is that both of these, and I'm actually just going to scratch this out. I mentioned that earlier, but both of these ended up with an odd number of letters. When you're done tracing, you'll end up in one of two situations. You will either have odd numbers of letters for both edges and corners, or you will have even numbers of letters for both edges and corners. You cannot have odd numbers of corners and even numbers of edges, or vice versa. There's some like really interesting Rubik's math behind that. So if you're interested in that stuff, then I encourage you to look it up, but you don't need to know why that's happening or how that happens to know how to blind solve. So if you're like me and that stuff's neat, but you don't want to know how it works, just trust that they will both be even or odd. And if they are even, so if these are both odd, but if they were both even, we would literally just do this. We would go corners, edges, memo, trace them, write them down, memorize them, whatever, and then execute your edges, execute your corners, or execute your corners and edges. Doesn't matter. You would just go straight into execution. It would be a beautiful, perfect solve, and everything would be right in the world. However, if you end up where both of these are odd, you have to do something called parity. This isn't traditional 4x4 parity or anything like that. It's just the word they use. And again, it's not super critical as to why or how this works. It's just something you need to know how to do if you run into this situation. So there's a bunch of different parity algs you can do, but the parity alg that I use is U prime into an RA perm into a U2. All right, so if you have an odd number of edges and corners, which is really the only way you can have odd numbers is if they're both odd, that means that you have to do the parity alg in between your execution of edges and corners. It doesn't matter if you execute corners first or edges first. It's just that you do it in between. You do this algorithm in between these two things. In this case, our tracing means that we have odd numbers, and that means we have to do parity in between these. So let's go ahead and start executing this solve. I'm going to be doing, again, kind of a fuzzy execution here where I'm going to try to memorize these, but I'm also going to feel okay if I look at the paper. You know, I'm not practicing memo right now. You can practice memo outside of cubing. What I want to happen right now is I want to solve this using these methods and these concepts that we've learned. That's all that matters to me right now. I'm not going to be closing my eyes, but I'm also not going to be like inspecting and looking at the cube in between each letter. I'm effectively going to try to do a full blind solve using our tracing here. And that's kind of, it's more important to get it right than it is to get it fast or to get it with my eyes closed. So let's go ahead and get started. If all is good in the world, we'll be able to just do some memorization here. And then start our execution. Let's go ahead and start by memorizing our edges. I'm going to go with Einstein, White House, Al from Full Metal Alchemist, and O.J. Simpson. GN could be a lot of stuff. GAN. And then there's an F at the end. And I sometimes will mark parity with an X because X doesn't have a letter on the cube. So it's just a free letter that I get. So facts, you know. So we've got Einstein at the White House, and who's with Einstein at the White House? We have Al from Full Metal Alchemist, and there's someone else, OJ Simpson and Al are there. And they're talking about GAN cubes. They're gonna fax somebody something about a GAN cube. So there it is. Boom. Einstein, White House, Al, OJ, GAN, fax. That's my edges memo. My corners memo is IK Multimedia box UNJC. So I'm just going to cover this up real quick and kind of think to myself before I execute this. My edges are Einstein at the White House, EIWH, AL for Al, OJ for OJ, GAN, GN, and fax, FX, which is just going to be F, and then parity. My corners are IK, BOX, IK box. There, I think there's a location and a person there too. So it's like IK box. This is why it's really important to make corners stick, because it's the last thing that you're doing, you know. In this case, we're doing fluffy solves, so we won't really, it won't really matter. We'll be able to look at the page if we really need to, but it'd be cool to be able to do it memorized, you know. Okay, so IK box UNJC. There it is. I found it. So my edges are EIWHALOJ GNFX, and my corners are IKBOX UNJC. So I'm going to do my best to remember that while I execute this. I'm not going to close my eyes, and I'm also not going to be referencing the page, but I will have the page in front of me. It's kind of a light practice. And if I go like, damn, IK box, fuck, I don't remember where it is or what it is or who it is, and I get really frustrated, then I'm going to look at the page and just be fine with that, you know, because again, the goal here is to have a solved cube at the end of the thing that we do here. So let's go ahead and start with edges execution. So I'm just going to get here. I'm looking at my wall kind of, thinking, what is my first memo? Einstein. So we start with E. Again, hopefully you've done a lot of edges practice here to know how to set E up. So E, right? T prime. E. Okay. I. EI. White House, right? UVW. That's right. Okay. H. And I'm taking my time here. I'm really not rushing. It's really important not to rush when you're doing this. You want to remember your setup moves. You want to just give yourself time for all of this. So White House, right? We just did White House. I think owl is there. So A. Owl, L, like L. O. I'm still just kind of like looking at my wall right now, just thinking. J, IJ. Okay. OJ, Al. So we had Einstein in the White House with OJ, Al and OJ, and they're GAN, GNFX, GNF. G, E, F, G. And again, my setups are unique to me. So, oh, that didn't feel right. I think I may have messed G up. My setups are unique to me, so whatever works for you with your setups, go with those. GN? Yeah, GN and then F. I really hope I got G right. I feel like I messed it up though. Okay, GN. And then F. All right. Now, at this point, I'll just give a quick little gander. I usually don't like doing this, but it looks like I've done it. It looks like my edges are solved, so I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, I didn't mess G up, which is nice. All right, now we go to our corners. I want to get this in my memory. I don't want to look at it. Oh, wait, no, we have parity because it's fax, F-A-X. So U, this is where parity comes into play. You do a U prime, an R perm, and then a U2, and that's an RA perm, by the way. Again, why we do that, I don't really know. Something math, but we do it if we have an odd number of both. All right, so my corners were something box, IK box UNJC. So I K, right? IJK. IJKL. Yeah. IJK. IKB. Oh, so no, I sometimes I'll think that I maybe had done the wrong moves, so I'll just undo those moves to remember. I thought I might went for Q there, but I did do B. B. Okay. That doesn't look right, but we'll see what happens. O. O. X. UVWX. I think that's right. U. N. J, IJ, J, IJ, so that's here and there, I think, IJC. And there it is, we solved it. That's absolutely incredible. And you can hear how much unsureness, because I'm not, that's why I call it a fluffy blind solve. Like, I'm not looking at the cube, you know, and I'm just kind of feeling it and going, that didn't feel right. Maybe I messed that up, but I'm just going to keep plowing through it, because if you did mess it up, you can usually tell at the end. But yeah, that's how blind solving works. There are, this is a great example solve too, and I want to tell you why. So this is a really good example solve because we ended up with 2 cycles per corners and edges, kind of 3 cycles on this one. We had a corner twist, we had 3 cycles, we had 2 cycles on our edges, and we had parity. So really, a really good blind solve, like a really lucky scramble for blind solving, is going to obviously not have parity. And you'll have like 1 or 2 solved corners and like 2 or 3 solved edges. That's like an insanely lucky blind solve. And it's just a matter of confidence in regards of like tracing your letters and memorizing them and then executing them. But the most difficult blind solves will have like 3 cycles for each one of these. So you're like swapping your buffer around all over the place. You've got like twisted corners and flipped edges all over the place. It's pretty gnarly, and you'll have parity. So the scramble that you get is oftentimes indicative of how difficult the solve is going to be. And as you start tracing, you'll start to see how difficult the scramble is. Or if you look down and you see that like you already have a twisted buffer and you've got 2 twisted corners, that's going to be troublesome, and like 3 flipped edges. So there's a lot of like tricks and tips to get through those problems, but really I think it's important to kind of boil it down to its core fundamental processes, which is solving your corners, solving your edges, and if you end up with an odd number for both of them, doing parity. So it's really only 3 algorithms. It's the modified Y-perm, which is a Y-perm without the F moves, the parity algorithm, which is an RA-perm with a U-prime at the beginning and a U2 at the end, and a T-perm to flip your edges. So I think it's important to keep it as simple as possible. And if you do get a very complicated scramble that has a lot of corner twists and edge flips, don't get discouraged when it's that difficult. Like, don't get discouraged that you're having trouble with it. It's insanely hard to keep track of all of that stuff. It's so hard to keep track of like 3 cycles and like, there's like this. How many letter pairs did we end up with here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So we're pretty lucky to have 10 of these, but you could end up with like 16 or 17 of these. And that's a big ask, So don't be ashamed and don't be afraid to write things down, because it is better to write a very difficult scramble down and execute it and do it and actually have it solved, rather than try to memorize an incredibly difficult scramble and execute it and then ending up with a scrambled cube at the end of the day and keeping it all in your brain. That you didn't learn anything. You didn't grow from that at all. So always go to pen and paper if you're feeling overwhelmed or you feel that you need to. And always, honestly, it helps so much to just go back to, if you're having a lot of trouble with the full 3 blind solves, go back to just doing corner scrambles for a little bit. Go back to just doing edges scrambles for a little bit, because it's all going to be beneficial in the long run, So yeah, it's all really, really part of the process. Every blind solve doesn't have to be done with a brute force memorization and all of your eye and your eyes closed. it's all just knowing how the concepts work. And I think anybody that can solve blind would agree that if someone can sit down and do if someone can sit down with any scramble and write it out like this, and then execute it with a fluffy blind solve with their eyes open, not looking at the cube, I feel as if that's way more beneficial to become a better blind solver than if you have someone who tries 20 scrambles without writing anything down and gets one of them right once, and the rest of them are just absolute nonsense. It's way better to be able to trace it and conceptually understand what's going on. It's a Y perm, a T perm, and an R perm. And it's so easy. It's so simple to solve corners only. It's so simple to solve edges only. And a blind solve is just executing edges, executing corners, occasionally with parity in between them. So if you understand these concepts really, really well, know that it's not about constantly getting blind solves done successfully with brute force memorization, and closing your eyes into it. It's about reinforcing these concepts over and over and over again and finding your weaknesses. I am bad with tracing, so I have to focus really hard on my tracing. You know what I mean? My execution has gotten a lot better. I've learned this finger tricking for this algorithm because I was having such a hard time with it, with the way my fingers were doing it, where I was thinking too much about it and oftentimes losing my place. So I had to sit down and just do this one over and over and over again. That way I could just do my setup moves and trust the algorithm. Same thing with my T-perm. My T-perm's weak. I need to re-finger trick my T-perm because right now I get lost when I do my T-perm. If I'm in the middle of it, I'll forget where I'm at. So just recognizing your weaknesses, understanding things conceptually, knowing when you've made a conceptual mistake and going back to practice the concepts. I think blind is incredibly attainable for everybody. And I think it's really critical that that you don't see being good at blind or knowing blind as being able to see any scramble and then memorize and execute and have a solved cube after you put a blindfold on in 5 minutes. Like, that's obviously the goal, but to attain that, you have to kind of like do this a lot. You have to write it down. It's about comfort. It's about feeling comfortable, you know? Like if I were to do like B in, you know, like in corners, there's the B and here's the N, you know, like that's really where blind solving comes in. Like that's the fun part about it, is just sitting down with a cube and with your eyes open. And even while you're having a conversation or something, just going, okay, so this would be in, B, and you just do in, and then you do B, and then it's going to be solved, you know, like, and just kind of like trusting that process, and knowing how well you're familiar. Familiarity is super critical, not execution. So anyway, that's how you solve a cube blind. If you have any questions, hit me up on Discord. And yeah, hopefully that's a good example. Oh, I want to put some tools in here for you. So really the things that happen with blind are you have parity, and then you have twists and flips and cycles. So I'll give you a scramble website that will give you parity. You can force parity. You can force not having parity. It's really fun. It's really fun to like know that you're not going to get parity and see how quickly you can just like do this. I will link to as many tools as I have. I've kind of forgotten the ones that I've gathered over the years. Not over the years, over the last few months. I guess it's been years now. I'll access, or I'll look up where those are and link them here. There's like memo practicing, there's tracing practicing, but I also want to make sure that you're not just going to blindly go for those tools. You know, like it's easy to get into the technique of stuff without the technique being necessitated. So only go to the tool when you know what your problem is, when you know where you need work. If you need work with tracing, then find the tool that's like, oh, it'll check to see if my tracing's right on a scramble. It'll give me a scramble, and then I can punch my trace in and see if it's correct. And that's specific for practicing tracing. If you want a memo, if you find your memo, you're having difficulty with that, there's specific tools for that. If you're finding yourself having trouble with parity, you know, like practice the algorithm and get a scramble that's going to force parity and try again and again and again. Again, to do a fluffy blind solve, get it on paper and execute it. It all works conceptually. And then, oh my God, it works in theory too, or in practice. So yeah, don't use the tools unless you need them, and I'll put them here. But yeah, have fun with it. It's again, not about getting it right, but about knowing what you got wrong and then being able to practice that specific component of the solve. Hopefully this was helpful. And again, if you have any questions, hit me up on Discord. Yeah, have fun. I love blind solving. I think it's absolutely fantastic. I think anybody that can solve a 3x3 can do blind solving.